Our first guest is Sunita Pattana. I believe that's how her last name is pronounced. Sunita is a psychotherapist and author based in East London who specializes in exploring the link between mind, body, spirit, and emotional healing. Since childhood, she's been fascinated with science, spirituality, and consciousness, and the deeper question of who we really are. She explores this question from a multidisciplinary perspective and implements the findings within her therapy practice. Sunita is a graduate of the University of Birmingham, where she obtained a degree in mathematics, science, and education, followed by a postgraduate certificate in education in 2004. Sunita taught for 5 years before she returned to college to study an advanced diploma in hypnotherapy and psychotherapeutic counseling, alongside running her psychotherapy practice. Those are some big words. She shares her message through a combination of speaking, running workshops, and writing. A regular blogger for the Huffington Post, Sunita's first book, called My Secret Affair with Chocolate Cake, The Emotional Eater's Guide to Breaking Free, was published in 2012. Her second book, The Transcendent Mind, The Missing Piece in Emotional Well-Being, was published in March of 2015. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get her on the line. Sunita, good evening. Welcome to K-Talk and the Fringe Radio Show.
Thanks, Pat. Great to be here.
Some big words in that bio, my friend.
I know. Psychotherapeutics, quite a big word, isn't it? I was listening to that. I was like, oh, it can be quite tongue twister.
Yeah, it is. It is a huge word. I was reading this thing, and I was like, wow, I was trying to read ahead. But anyway, it is an honor to have you here. Now, you are in the United Kingdom right now, correct? That's where you live?
That's right. Yep, that's right. So it's very early in the morning here.
I bet. How is your weather in that part of the world?
Actually, it's not been too bad. We've had quite a good summer this year. It was very warm today. It was 30 degrees today here. So it was very, very warm for us, by our standards. But yeah, it's not bad. Quite good.
Well, very good. And I do want to thank you. I know we had Sunita scheduled to come on the show on the 6th of June. And that was the night our little family cat of 23 years passed away, and she was so kind to reschedule. So thank you for all your kind words and rescheduling tonight. Talk about just like a family member after that many years.
Oh, yeah, you know what? That's really understandable, actually, because as we're sitting here, we've got our cat. He's just he's kind of sprawled out on the floor. I think it's quite warm for him as well. So I understand they really do become part of the family, don't they?
Oh, they do. Even if they get into things and make a mess, you still love them no matter what.
You do.
Well, I read a little bit of your bio, and I just scratched the surface. But what kind of pushed you in the direction that you've gone in your life? Things happened to mention in there about since childhood. Why don't you give us our listeners a little bit of background of where you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think usually we tend to sort of have circumstances in life that do push us in certain directions at times, quite rightly. And I think always from a young age, I've always sort of been curious as to the bigger questions of life. I mean, I often say that I remember being about 5 or 6 and actually thinking, which is very, very strange for a 5 or 6-year-old, thinking about what would happen if there was no more Earth or no more universe, which is a very, very daunting question at that age, because, you kind of tend to think, well, what would happen if nothing existed,
Right.
So I think really there was a natural inclination towards, this line of work from a very young age. And then it wasn't really, until I actually started off, as you said, as a teacher. And then in my mid-20s, kind of life sort of took a turn and, went through quite a dark patch. And that's really when I started to reconnect with my interest in this area, because I was looking for personal answers, Mm-hmm. And that slowly sort of rekindled the passion that I had in this line of work. And it just sort of went from there. It wasn't really something that I planned as such. It was such a personal interest. And, before I knew it, I was sort of reading a lot, and then I decided to go back to college and working on myself, and it kind of just took the direction. I wouldn't even say, it wasn't planned or anything. It just kind of took on a life of its own, so to speak.
To find answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Very interesting, very interesting. Well, we want to talk about your latest book, but I am curious about your first book, My Secret Affair with Chocolate Cake, The Emotional Eater's Guide. Tell us a little bit about that book. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I tell you what, that title grabs a lot of attention, actually.
It does, it does.
Yeah, it does. It's quite a playful title. But, you know, I had always really suffered with a disordered relationship with food, which eventually turned into an eating disorder in my mid-20s. And My Secret Affair with Chocolate Cake is really the journey that I sort of went on in order to heal my relationship with food. So that's really what that book is about. It shows readers how, you know, if you've had a disordered relationship, or if you've suffered with binge eating disorder or emotional eating, it'll actually show you step by step how to break free from that, you know, certain things that you can do. So it's a very, very tough period, I would say, in my life. But retrospectively looking at it, it was great because it sort of set the foundation for me to actually ask the right questions to lead me where I am today.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you talk about the relationship you had with food, and I think that can probably of all of the groups, things that we could potentially consume. Of course, there's food, and of course, there's alcohol and drugs. I mean, anything we can get in our mouths. Food being probably the safest of them all. I think a lot of people, and I know people that food or drink becomes such an important. It becomes part of their life that they in some cases they just plain can't control it. And it literally is amazing that act. Of course, we've got to feed our bodies so that we feel okay, and you know we can keep going on. But it is amazing how we can. Some people and can live their lives around consuming some of these items.
Absolutely, Pat. And you know, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, because I think that your relationship with food, when it gets to that point, it becomes a really complex relationship with food. And I think one of the most difficult things that a lot of people in my situation face is that when you suffer, because I actually believe that when I was suffering with the binge eating disorder, it is an addiction, you know, and there's a lot of sort of opinion on whether it's an addiction or whether it isn't. But having been through it, you know, I can definitely say it was for me, you know, an addiction. And the hardest thing about it was this, that with other, you know, addictions, if you're talking about alcohol or drugs, you can actually go, you know, kind of teetotal. You can completely stop them, and, you know, your life will get better. And the challenge with food is, of course, you've got to eat on a daily basis. Right. So it's a constant struggle. And if it's not tackled in the right way, you're quite right. In one respect, it's probably the safest in terms of, you know, addictions or disorders to be suffering with. But I think in another respect, it can probably be somewhat very, very hard, because you can't give it up altogether. So you've got to learn the balance, you know. You've got to correct the physiology and the psychology behind the eating in order to make a proper recovery.
And I've noticed that a lot of people that have issues with either food or alcohol or even drugs, they sometimes, and I've seen this with some friends that have gone through, at least with food problems, they almost become two individuals. They become the individual that is actually consuming the food, and then they tend to reason with themselves. I had one good friend of mine who was enormously large. I ended up getting a gastric bypass surgery, and that's what it took, because he could just not control himself. But some of these things, like, you know, buying a half a gallon of ice cream, taking 2-3 scoops and saying, this isn't good for me, throwing it in the garbage, half hour later digging it out of the garbage can and eating it again. And how he told me how he literally became two people talking to himself from two different sides. You know, it's amazing with some of these addictions, if you want to call it. It's amazing some of the things that can happen to an individual. They can actually become two people.
Absolutely. In fact, if any of your listeners actually ever get around to reading My Secret Affair with Chocolate Cake, it's interesting you say that, because that's one of the first things that I mention in the book. That, you know, when I used to go into there used to be a certain time during the day, Pat, when it really used to kick in bad. And I often used to say that, during that time, it was like there was another person inside of me. It was like I was almost possessed, quite frankly,
No, I know.
It's just an extreme manifestation of what your ego's doing at that time. You go into a food trance. That's the only way that I can describe it. You can't think of anything else other than, what am I going to eat? How quickly can I get it? And it's not satisfying enough. And I knew for me things had gotten really bad when it didn't actually matter how much I was eating. It wasn't satisfying the emptiness that was in there. It's a little bit like being almost like being a drug addict, that over time
Right.
I needed more of it
Right.
to get that high, so to speak,
If you don't mind me asking, how did you break the cycle? What did it take for you to step out of that?
The actual trigger was literally I woke up one morning and I didn't see it coming at all. And my husband sort of said to me, he said, "You know what?" He said, "I can't be with you anymore." He said, "Because I don't know how to help you. You're not letting me in." And he was right, of course. And that was really the trigger. And that then sort of started the journey to, right, well, I can't diet, because dieting was one of the things that actually led to the eating disorder developing itself, So for me, that wasn't a no-go, it was a no-go, so to speak. And so I then had to start very, very slowly, and it was really the journey of learning how to trust myself, and it was very, very difficult. I'm not going to kind of sugarcoat it, because,
Right.
the binge episodes would kick in, and I would have to literally find ways to not give in. And there would be days where it would be really good, and then there would be days where, I would kind of succumb to the binge. But over time, ever so slowly, it started getting better. And, the recovery did take a little bit of a while, but I'm so glad I did it this way, because I recognize retrospectively, you've got to, first of all, for anybody out there that may be suffering from this sort of stuff, you've got to find out what your personal triggers are, because everybody's different, And you see, the thing with binge eating as well is that you tend to gain weight with it. So quite often you've got people saying to you, right, you need to watch what you're eating. And you're talking to someone. I mean, I was literally a walking, talking encyclopedia on nutrition. I was very good with, I knew everything about food because I was just obsessed with it. But you've got to find out what your personal triggers are, and they're not always psychological. They could be biological as well. It could be that certain foods are triggering you to want more of that certain food. So it's a very personal journey. But the great thing about it is it's not just about the food. It changes you as a person. It really does, if you allow it to. It'll open the doors, really open the doors up to your inner universe.
Interesting, very interesting. And it is amazing that, and I think you're right, and it happens to so many. Some sort of major event has to take place for most people to snap out of it. You need that snap of reality, like you said. Your husband said to you, "Hey, I don't know how to help you. Maybe it's time for me to go a different direction so you can do your thing." And I mean, that's a big thing. That's huge. That's huge for any of us, especially if our partner wants to leave us. Sadly, that's what it usually takes in most people's lives, or in an alcoholic's lives, to almost kill somebody, or hopefully they don't kill somebody, or in a drug addict's life to almost die. It's it takes that big shock factor to sometimes turn things around.
Absolutely. And I think it's not just about, and I often say to people that, we got back together shortly afterwards, but I often say to people that it wasn't just a journey, I think, that I went on. It was definitely a journey that my partner went on as well. You can't, it was such a big part of my life, so you're quite right, but I think sometimes it's a good thing when you have the little shake-up, because it makes you reconsider things, and hopefully gives you the strength and the courage to start the healing journey.
Speaking of healing, if we could move a little bit on here. I was looking through, of course, through all the notes that were sent to me, and it sounds like, well, it doesn't sound like, what you do is you help people heal emotionally in your day-to-day work.
Absolutely, yeah. So I am another big word, she says. Yeah, so I'm a psychotherapist. Which is basically, a counselor. And it's that's really what I do. I have a private practice, so I get to see a lot of interesting, cases, and get to work with a lot of really amazing people, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see the healing process, and I learn so much through them. Pat, you learn so much when you get to really glimpse very closely inside the lives of other people, and you really get a somewhat of an understanding of how people work and what propels them to do what they do.
With your practice, well, again, as you said, you learn from other people. I would assume that every case is different. Every person has something different. Everybody's what's the words I'm looking for? Everybody's level of severity of help that they need has got to be different. What may seem very small to some people is a small issue to some others. It's gigantic, and maybe vice versa. Something huge to others is not a big deal. But I would say it's got to be an interesting line of work, especially when you can see progress. That's the biggest thing. All these things take time.
They do. And I think one of the best sayings ever is time is the greatest healer, and it really is. And I talk about this in the book, that you come in for psychotherapy, and to a certain extent, Pat, I'll help you with tools. We'll talk through things, and you start to make progress. But ultimately, there's a natural healing that takes place within everybody, and we can only do. And I talk about the difference between intending and allowing when it comes to emotional healing, that we can set the intention to heal, and we can use particular tools, particular techniques, but there comes a point where we can't rush the healing. We can't rush because we're not in control of that, I don't think.
Right.
There's a natural healing process that takes place within us, and sometimes it is a case of just waiting and allowing the healing process to take place whilst we're doing whatever it is that we can to move it along.
A question I have for you is, being a psychotherapist, does it sometimes take you? I mean, you're a professional. You see a lot of different people. I'm sure you've run the gamut as far as cases. But does it sometimes take you, as a professional, many sessions, many hours to actually find out what the problem really is?
No. No, it doesn't. And I think that's because, Pat, it's interesting because although every case is different that you come across, actually, most of the time, most people are struggling with the same underlying issue. And, that is a lack of self-worth and a lack of self-love. That when you break down most issues out there, and I always say most because I would almost say all, but I always say most because you can never say never. They all come down to the same thing. So usually, and I've worked with many, many hundreds of clients now, and I think after working with that many people, you know that potentially, okay, this is what's going to come out. So you kind of, where to steer them with the right questions in order to get them to answer in a way that's going to, where they're going to learn about themselves. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, and again, because you do it so much, but I've just noticed, read quite a few books and have done a lot of research about, the whole, the mind is a very complex thing. The mind and the spirit coupled together are very complex, but so many people, I don't know if they tend to, if they seek help, and they don't want to come out with what's really wrong, they come in, and they dance around the subject. But again, a person like yourself who deals with this all the time, you probably can tell when they're doing everything to avoid what they really want to talk about.
Absolutely, and I can usually do that fairly quickly. And the thing is, Pat, I think with my line of work, I think that every therapist is different as well. So I don't think that there's a one size fits all, and I think everybody works differently. But the way that I tend to work is, I tend to really tap into my intuition when I'm working with people. So, sometimes people need a little bit of gentle guidance, but then sometimes there does come a time when it's like, okay, look, we've got to perhaps look at this from a different perspective. So I think it's based very much on the individual that you're working with, but there does come a time where, you do have to tough love is the best way to put it. That there comes a time when it's like, okay, well, you're coming in here, frequently enough. You're paying me to help you, and I want it to be productive for you. So there does come a time when I tend to say, okay, look, let's just step back for a minute and look at the facts and really look at what's going on here,
Exactly. Let's talk a little bit about, if it's okay, let's talk a little bit about your new book, The Transcendent Mind. Where did you, in your line of work and as you being an author, what pushed you or drove you to write this book?
That's a really good question, actually. So coming back, we've been talking about therapy. So what basically happened was, Pat, when I first got into psychotherapy and got into this line of work, I set up a private practice because I always wanted to work for myself. And I started getting clients coming in, which was great. And what I started noticing was that some of these clients were making good progress with traditional psychotherapy, how I'd been trained. And yet some of them were coming in and they weren't making very good progress. Now, my first question was that, okay, well, this is interesting. You're not moving. So maybe it's me because I'm new in the game and, you need experience. And I thought, it could just be that I haven't got enough experience. But then I was finding that some of these people had previous therapists. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. It can't all be me because, they've been elsewhere before. And then naturally I started to ask, okay, well, maybe it's you. Do you really want to be here? And yes, there were always going to be some people that aren't completely ready,
Right.
But a vast majority of those people, they were really wanting to change. And that really got me thinking. And that's really when I started reading around the topic, that, okay, this is what I've learned with traditional psychotherapy. Now, what else is there out there? Are there any more viewpoints? And that's really when I got into reading. Are you familiar, Pat, with A Course in Miracles?
No, I'm not.
Okay, it's quite a prominent text in that if you're into the mind and stuff, you might want to check it out. It's a great book, actually.
I will.
And so I started reading A Course in Miracles, and in that book, Pat, I came across a really, really fascinating concept, and that concept was that there was one mind. Okay, there was one mind, and that every human being was an individualization or a manifestation of that one mind. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because that would mean that technically all of us, although we appear to be separate, we're actually one, And so I read that and I thought, okay. And then I went on to read the spiritual text, the Bhagavad Gita, which is the Hindu, taken from the Hindu faith. It's probably one of the most ancient sort of spiritual texts, that follow along. And it was very interesting because this text, now the first book, A Course in Miracles, was, written by two psychologists. So it was Western in its nature. And here I was reading Eastern philosophy, and it was saying the same thing, that there was this all-pervasive consciousness, that some people may refer to as God. But here's the interesting thing, that there only was this one pervasive consciousness. There was nothing else. So, in other words, we were manifestations of that. And so by this time, now I'm thinking, oh my goodness, two sets of completely different books from completely different corners of the world, sort of saying the same thing. Now, if this is really true, if we do have a soul, and if we are supposedly one, and if there is a grander consciousness, where am I going to go to validate this? How am I going to actually go and, because this is huge.
Sure.
This goes way beyond what I've been taught in traditional psychology or psychotherapy. So naturally, the next place that I thought was, because I'd briefly heard about this topic, was near-death experiences. And at that time, I didn't realize that near-death experiences were actually an academic area of study. And as I started to look into them, my goodness, Pat, did it blow my mind. I started reading hundreds of case studies, and I really, really got into researching not just, the stories and what was happening to people, but also from a medical perspective, that, what was happening when people have a cardiac arrest, for example. There's a lot of theory to suggest that near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences are psychological phenomena. And I don't doubt that this is the case in some cases. I do think that that's probably valid with some of the cases. But then you had the anomalies. You were having people who had cardiac arrest. The heart would stop beating, no blood flow to the brain. If there's no blood flow to the brain, you're not actually, the brain begins to die after a few seconds, and you can't actually process. If you have no brain to process, how are people coming back and recounting these experiences to great detail? So I really, really got into this, and that's really when I started to recognize that I think there's a greater truth, and that's really what the transcendent mind is about. The fact that, we are not just individual, and we're not just our individual minds, but in fact we are a greater mind, and it's really about recognizing and understanding our place in the grander scheme of things. And I believe that really, really does aid emotional healing.
Wow. It throws a, if I could digress just a little bit, it's got to throw a, the field of study that you're in, and you're helping people. And now when you try to tackle this, I mean, this is a whole new realm, a whole new dimension, a whole new universe, the complexity of it, and then trying to look forward. I mean, I think like with a lot of these things, kind of like we do this program, we cover all kinds of different topics, from ufology to paranormal research to psychics and mediums and just things, I mean, we've done so many shows that have touched so many different subjects. And of course, life after death in our next phase, and if you want to call it our spiritual evolution, more and more people are being, or I think more and more professional people are saying, okay, when you die, when you pass away. Years ago, I think the theory was, well, that's it. He's dead. She's gone. That's it. It's all over. But now they're seeing, I mean, there's more and more researchers, more and more professional people that are saying, wait a minute, there is more to this. There is something else behind that. And trying to mix that with your day-to-day professional work, helping people, and then also thinking about some of these other things, it makes it a pretty complex pot of soup.
It does, and I think, you're quite right in what you're saying. I think the time has come where, we've got like the World Wide Web now, where people can share a lot of information and stuff, and I think that what you're saying is very true, and I think that's exactly the process that I've gone through, that, traditional psychotherapy for many people just wasn't cutting it.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Fringe Radio. Our guest tonight, Sunita. Again, thank you so much for getting up in the middle of the night, or staying up until the middle of the night to talk with us.
No problem, my pleasure.
Let me ask you, first of all, for our listeners, your book, The Transcendent Mind, where can our listeners get your book?
It's available on Amazon. It may actually be available in Barnes & Noble, actually, I believe, in the U.S., So, but I think Amazon's probably your best bet.
Gotcha. Do you have another book in the works by any chance?
There is another book in the works, but I won't mention too much about that at the moment, because that's actually going to be a joint project. So, there will be, probably at some point next year, I think.
Oh, very good. All right, let's get back to this one a little bit, and just going through some of the talking points, some of the questions. Emotional wounding. What is that?
Well, I think emotional wounding is basically a term that I use to describe how we are wounded as we grow up emotionally. So, what tends to happen, Pat, is that we all have obviously experiences as we're growing up. And these experiences can actually leave a lasting impact on us and create emotional wounds that actually drive our behavior, So emotional wounding is all about recognizing what your patterns are and where it is that you've got these emotional wounds, because once you know, then you can start working on healing them.
Is it difficult is that I would assume that might be a difficult process to take people through to discover those wounds first.
It can be, but usually what happens is they come in because they're experiencing some form of manifestation from those wounds. So for example, I might get somebody come in with anxiety issues or depression or extreme anger, and then as you really look at, all right, what is causing this, and as you start to take the journey of working your way backwards, that's when you start to kind of have a look at that. Okay, well, actually, this is where it came from originally, and it may not be what you think is causing it, and it may actually go back to childhood issues. So yeah, it can take time sometimes, but usually again, it comes down to asking the right questions, and people kind of learn more about themselves.
What do you do to help people move forward and heal through this stuff? I mean, what are some of the things that you can put out there? Of course, you're a professional, and I'll just back that up and say that I don't think people should try to self-diagnose themselves. If they have an issue, I think they need a professional. I think some people try to do self-diagnosis, and I think that can confuse a person more or maybe make them angry more. But what are some of the healing processes? Is maybe acceptance, first of all, one of them, to accept that you have these issues? I mean, how do you help a person get through these things?
I mean, the first thing to recognize is that, it's first knowing that you've got an issue and actually willing to work on that issue. I think there are a lot of people out there that know that they have certain issues but aren't yet willing to actually look at them because, for whatever reason, it can be quite daunting taking a real hard look at what's going on with you on the inside, Other than that, I think, Pat, every client that I come across is different. Now, when I work with people, usually the way that I tend to work is, right, what are you coming in with? What is the present issue, first of all? So, what is the manifestation? Like I said, it could be depression or, whatever it is that you're coming in with. Then I take them down the path of looking at, okay, so where's this coming from? What is it in your past or your present that is leading to this? Once we've established that, and there is a time for this, Pat, because there's a time for talking, and there's a time for getting things off your chest, and then there's a time for, right, now how are we actually going to move this forward depending on what it is? And of course, it really does depend on the issue. So, for example, if you're dealing with somebody who's going through a bereavement, that can't be rushed. It takes time for a person to process the feelings, the emotions. It really is a process that takes time. Whereas if you're dealing with somebody, let's say, with an eating disorder, binge eating disorder, for example, the process may be somewhat different because there comes a time when you're going to need tools and techniques, to help you move forward in order to help the healing process. So it's very much a combination of listening very intently and really empathizing, listening, and allowing the person to speak about what it is that they need to talk about. But it's also teamed up with, right, how are we going to move forward from here now? So strategy, really moving forward, So that's the way that I tend to work.
Very interesting. We got a question from one of our good listeners. We have a group of engineering students up at the University of Utah here that listen to us, and I want to thank them for always being there for us. One of the questions that Tracy wrote in, she said, Sunita, are there times that you work with individuals that claim they're dealing with outside forces, maybe something paranormal, maybe something extraterrestrial? Has that ever come across your desk?
Yes, it has, actually, on I wouldn't say a number of occasions. It's been rare, but it has happened. You see, the interesting thing is that not so much extraterrestrial, but paranormal, definitely. The interesting thing is that I'm actually Indian by culture, and in the Eastern cultures, it's not uncommon for people to talk about, well, it looks like that, you may have like a negative, spirit or entity or something like that, sort of meddling with your life and things, and that's very, very accepted in some of the Eastern cultures. So yeah, it is something that I have come across before. I'm very careful with the way that I deal with things. And sometimes I will say that, it's not really in my line of work. So maybe I would refer them on perhaps to somebody who would work in that field of work. But I think the key thing is that I don't rule anything out. After having written The Transcendent Mind and exploring the paranormal, because I don't just talk about near-death experiences in the book, I also talk about parapsychology and, the findings of sort of intuition and the fact that there's something else out there perhaps. So I don't write anything off, but it's just that I don't always feel that I'm the right person to help a person in that area. So, yeah.
But it does come across your desk every now and then.
It does, yes, yes.
It is amazing. We've had people who have claimed to have had what they'll consider an extraterrestrial encounter and work with hypnotherapists and stuff. It's definitely an area in what you do too. When I don't want to use the word playing with somebody's mind. I think that's a cheap shot. But I mean, when you're getting involved with a human being, especially if you're doing regression therapy or anything that involves the mind, and again, some of these subjects, paranormal, extraterrestrial, whatever they may be, near-death experiences, or maybe death experiences where they have died and they have come back. Those are there's a lot of complexity there.
There is, Pat. And you know what? This is precisely why I wrote the book, The Transcendent Mind, because it's important to, first of all, have an understanding of what some of those complexities are about. Now, this is just my personal opinion, so this isn't, it's not set in stone. But the thing is this: when you're dealing, and you're quite right, when you're dealing with areas of the subconscious mind, you've got to, in my opinion, I think you've got to have read around the topic and looked at alternative viewpoints. That actually, what is the subconscious mind? So let's have a look at past life regression, for example. Where is the information actually coming from? And this is precisely why, having consideration of that greater mind that we're part of, that I'm convinced actually that does exist and we are part of, having a knowledge of that and an understanding of what that is becomes very, very important when you start working with people on the level of the mind, because you're right, the mind is a lot more complex, than what traditional psychology, I think, would say.
What's your feeling on, if I could ask you, your feeling of life after death? Do you feel that we're an energy or a spirit or a soul or an essence, and this is just a stopping point along the journey?
Yeah, I definitely, I am of the opinion, I believe that we are souls. I believe that we're on a journey, and I believe that the experience that we're having at the moment, the earthly experience that we're having at the moment, is designed to help us to remember who we are or enhance, who we are as an individual. And again, the book covers many case studies. I think it's chapter 1 or 2 in the book, where I look at many case studies of people that have had that experience and have come back with remarkable stories to tell, more about the essence of who we are and what the purpose of us actually being here is. So yes, I do actually believe that we are souls, and I believe that once we shed our physical bodies, we do actually move on. And I do believe that we're here to, learn certain lessons, so to speak, to become better people.
Well, I know some people feel that it's, and I guess that is, your specific situation. There's some people that feel that life as a human on Earth here, this is hell we're going through now, and and it can only get better. There are people that feel that it's a great world, a great life, and something great to experience. And of course, you talk about the subject of reincarnation. Some people that feel that they've been around a few times and maybe want to do it a few other times and do it from different perspectives through different people or maybe even different creatures. And again, we're starting to, as you said, I don't want to say that there's the physical evidence, but maybe there is that this does happen, that these other, if we there's other dimensions. We know the human eye can only see 2% of the light spectrum, what's in the other 98% that we're not looking at, or what could be right there in front of us and we can't see. And the more we dig into these subjects and have experts like yourself on it, as I'm sure you do more and more work in your field, it just opens more and more doors, but yet a lot more questions, but cool questions, interesting stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it all really does come down to perspective, really, doesn't it, Pat? You know, and I think that's the gift of life. One of the greatest gifts of life is choosing your own perspective and having free choice, you know, with how you wish to live your life, at least from you know, a mind level. You know, I mean, have you come across the book A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl at all?
No, I haven't.
Absolutely phenomenal. You know, I mean, this was a guy, a psychiatrist, in fact, who was Jewish, I think, in Nazi Germany, and spent a few years in the concentration camps. And, you know, it was really beautiful. When he came out, he survived, and he wrote the book. And you know, that was one of the key things. He made the decision as to how he was going to perceive the circumstances that were going on around him. So I think it really does come down to perception and what you're choosing and how you choose to view life. So, yeah.
And it can either be a good view or a bad view, and I think a lot of times our own mental outlook on life has so much to do with ourselves. Others can't change it. I think sometimes you have to look at least with me, I try to, is so many of us, and I think myself, I've had it happen too, where you can get down on things and you feel that everything is against you, but have to look at it as, you know, the glass is half full versus it's half empty.
Exactly. It all comes down to personal choice. You know, Pat, it's for your listeners out there, if they actually visit my website, which is www.sunitapattani.com, they can actually download for free one of the chapters from the book where I actually go through the 7 tools of healing, and they can just get that for free from the website. And I actually talk about perception in that and how to alter and change your perception in order to give it more of a positive stance.
Very interesting. One of our other listeners had emailed in, Cynthia emailed in, and she wanted me to ask you, do you do online workshops or online work at all?
Yes, I do online. There will be online workshops fairly soon. I do a lot of online one-to-one work, actually, whether that's through email or through Skype. But actually, interestingly enough, I am in the US in 2 weeks. I'm flying out on the 10th of September.
Oh, okay.
And I'm actually teaching 2 workshops, one in Seattle on the 11th and 12th. And this is all about contacting your higher self within, and there's actually tools and techniques that I can take you through that enable you to do that. So there's one in Seattle, and there's going to be one in Oregon on the 18th and 19th of September.
Wow, very good. Well, you won't be that far from Utah.
Indeed.
Very good.
That's right.
Well, our time has run up. The hour has gone awfully quick. Sunita, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. Again, her book is called The Transcendent Mind, The Missing Piece in Emotional Well-Being. And give out your website one more time where our listeners can go.
Yep, it's www.sunita, S-U-N-I-T-A, Pattani, P-A-T-T-A-N-I.com.
Awesome. I hope we can get you back on again. I need to, I did get a copy of the book. I need to read through it. I paged through it. I'll be honest with you. I won't lie. Of course, I looked through a little bit, but after talking with you, I need to spend a little bit more time digging deeper, and I wish you the best on your conferences, and maybe in the later fall, if you don't mind staying up late one night, we could chat again.
Absolutely. It'd be my pleasure, Pat. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, my friend. Get some sleep. Have a good night. Take care. God bless, and we'll talk again.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye-bye.
good night. Bye-bye.